Hello, 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 and welcome once again to CorpusCast, the podcast all about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society from Aston University. I'm your host, as always, Dr. Robbie Love. I hope you're doing well. For many of you, I imagine you're gearing up to start a new academic year this September. And whether you're a student or an academic, one of the things you'll probably be thinking about sooner or later is academic writing. Maybe your own academic writing or thinking about how to support your students' academic writing. Now, this is a topic that we did cover quite a long time ago, back in episode 17 with Dr. Kevin Jiang. Today, we're returning to this topic, but in the context of learner corpora, which is our main topic for today's episode. A learner corpus, quite simply, is a corpus made up of text produced by learners of a language. And my guest today will share how she uses learner corpora to help university students write in English, specifically when it's their second language. And of course, that's an awful lot of students who are in that boat. My guest today is Shelley Staples, professor at the University of Arizona, professor of English. Shelley has a PhD from Northern Arizona University, and her research focuses on the use of corpus-based discourse analysis to investigate language use across spoken and written contexts. Specifically, the purpose of Shelley's research is to understand how linguistic variation is related to situational factors and speaker characteristics, including register, first language, cultural background, and proficiency levels of second language speakers. Her publications include the monograph, The Discourse of Nurse-Patient Interactions, a very interesting topic in and of itself, but not one that we'll be covering in today's episode. The edited volume, Talking at Work, Corpus-Based Explorations of Workplace Discourse, a co-authored book, The Register Functional Approach to Grammatical Complexity, and she's very, very widely published otherwise as well in journals, including Applied Linguistics, TESOL Quarterly, Journal of Second Language Writing, and many others. And she's also the principal investigator of two projects that will be coming up in today's episode, two learner corpus projects, which have wonderful names: CROW, the Corpus and Repository of Writing, and McCAWS, the multilingual corpus of assignments, writing, and speech. So an awful lot for us to get through today. Learner corpora, of course, a really, really broad and very productive area of research in corpus linguistics and language learning and English for academic purposes and English for specific purposes. So there's an awful lot for us to get through today. So without any further adu, I'm really, really pleased and grateful to have Professor Shelley Staples on the show. A bit of an early morning for you, Shelley, but thank you very much for joining us on CorpusCast. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, Robbie. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to get the chance to speak to you, and you are somebody that I've hoped for quite some time that we'd get on the show. So I'm really grateful that that you've agreed to do it, and we found some time to make this happen, despite the not insignificant time difference between us. So thanks once again. And I really want to, sort of get inside your mind a little bit, find out what makes you tick when it comes to corpus linguistics and the research that you do. So I'll start with the question I always begin with, asking all of our guests here on the show: what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Thanks. Yeah. So as many others have probably talked about, I do see corpus linguistics as a methodology, but you can also see that I'm very interested in looking at a variety of language use. So I see it as a methodology that allows for the exploration of actual language use across a variety of situations, including speech and writing, but also more fine-grained domains like the ones that you mentioned, healthcare communication between nurses and patients, or specific genres of academic writing. That's more the focus for today. And I also see it as both a quantitative and qualitative method for discourse analysis that can be extremely useful for informing language teaching. And that's a big part of my work as well, is seeing how we can apply the findings from corpus linguistics to that domain.
I'm always really interested to hear from researchers in this field how they got into corpus linguistics, because it's not something that necessarily has a great deal of visibility when you're growing up and going to school and thinking about what you might want to do with your life in the future. So tell us a bit of, about your story. How did you end up becoming a professor and a researcher in corpus linguistics? What was your journey?
Yeah, so I very much came to corpus linguistics as a classroom teacher. So I think that's a lot of why I'm really interested in bringing it back to the classroom. I was a lecturer for almost 10 years before I got my PhD. And it was then that I got exposed to corpus linguistics. I always tell my origin story as seeing Doug Biber speak at TESOL in 2004, a long time ago. And then just really getting excited about all the research that was coming out. I was reading a lot in JEEP and ESP Journal because the context of my teaching was very much EAP and ESP. And so from there, I tried things out in my classroom, trying to bring corporate into the classroom through things like LexTutor, and then eventually committed to the field and applied to a few schools, but NAU was definitely my top choice. And I was excited to go and work with Doug, but also with Randy Reppin. So I had been really inspired by the work that she was doing and continues to do, translating corpus research for the classroom.
So you've sort of sat under the learning tree, I suppose, of researchers who have done so much in the field, and you yourself as someone who has done quite a lot of different things. You mentioned the nurse-patient interactions earlier. That's a whole other episode that we could get into, all of the healthcare communication work that you've done as well. But for today, you've mentioned already your interest in language learning, and we're going to focus in on your use of learner corpora in the context of second language or L2 writing. So I suppose let's kind of set the scene and think more about the kind of context that you typically work in your research in this particular area. Are we talking about students at universities who are writing in English as a second or additional language? And what sort of point in the journey are you particularly interested in applying corpus methods to try to help them, I suppose?
Yeah, so this was definitely where I got my start, working actually mostly with international graduate students, but also academic professionals that were working so very high level. Since then, actually at that time too, I was also working with undergraduates at the very beginning of their undergraduate careers, and that's where I've focused my research and the corpus building for Crow more recently. And so when I think about these students, these are generally international students coming from a variety of countries, but still commonly China, Saudi Arabia. At U of A, where I work, we also get a number of students from Central and South American countries, particularly Mexico, because we're very close. They're generally interested in developing academic literacy, including academic writing, and they want to be successful in a variety of careers. And so this context is also kind of specific to the US, where we have a lot of general education requirements as part of our undergraduate degree, unlike a lot of countries. And so this context is called first year or foundations writing. And students are required to take this regardless of their language background. So that's another thing. It's we have kind of parallel courses that students can choose if they're international or second language writers, but they follow the same kind of sequence as domestic students would take. So it's a little different than like a pre-sessional or additional course that they were taking. And so these students are, in this particular corpus, the Crow corpus, are definitely high intermediate to advanced learners, but they're working on academic writing skills. Some of the research that I do is very relevant, I would say, for first language English users as well. And so That's something that I look at as well. But the academic socialization processes are a little different for these students coming from other countries.
So this is a separate kind of module that the students are taking, which is not about the disciplinary content of what they're studying on their course at university, but rather specifically and solely interested in how to write in the academic context, right?
Exactly. Sometimes they get a little bit into those disciplinary writing practices, so there are opportunities for them to kind of research and explore what those are in majors that they're interested in. But actually in the US, students don't have to come in having declared a major. And like I said, they have these general education requirements. So regardless of their major, they're actually going to be taking classes in a variety of disciplines. And so we're trying to prepare them for that experience as well as their writing in their major.
So we'll go into more detail about Crow in a moment, but I think it would probably be helpful for listeners who maybe are not so familiar with the broader kind of idea behind the approaches that you take in your research. What I'm going to ask it bluntly, but what can a corpus linguist do to help, right? If we're thinking about learner corpora particularly, what is the broad kind of rationale behind building a corpus in this context, and what is the kind of ultimate aim in terms of how it may help these students?
Yeah, so I do think I take a slightly different approach to learner corpora than some others have. I definitely am still looking for places for improvement for writing. But I also see that these texts in and of themselves are representative of the writing context that the students are working in. And so because of that, I'm also kind of mining it as you would any corpus. So I'm looking for lexicogrammatical patterns that are common in the types of assignments that students are doing in this context. And so they're able to see what language is commonly used. They can actually make decisions if they want to use that commonly used language or if they want to kind of depart from that. So that's very much a part of the pedagogy that goes on in these classes, is kind of helping students to make rhetorical and linguistic choices. But the corpus assists in that it's able to show students this is what is going on in these texts. We look at not only concordance lines for fine-grained examination of linguistic features, but also larger portions of text. So students will do text analysis on the discourse level to kind of see what are the major moves within these types of assignments. And a lot of this is also in the service of building their genre awareness, which is a big part of the pedagogy in this context, is kind of helping students to see what genres are, what are some of the conventions, which is where the language comes in. And then in this way, they can apply that to new genres that they might encounter later on in their academic studies.
So this does sound somewhat different to what I've sort of typically encountered with how researchers approach learner corpora. Often in learner corpus research, you hear about error tagging and identifying what researchers do literally call errors, and trying to help students to find out what to avoid doing or what to change. But it sounds like it sounds like this is a bit of a different approach, where it's more about I suppose enculturing new members of a community into what the reality of the discourses are. I suppose, rather than thinking about here's what you're technically doing wrong, instead it seems that you're using it as a way to introduce students to a writing or a discourse community. Am I sort of going along the right lines here? It does seem to be quite a different approach to this.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly it. And not to say that we don't look at a more effective and less effective language within this context. Of course we do. But I think by bringing in these texts that are more relevant to the learners, they're able to see what's possible. And also by using student texts, it also shows that their writing is is worthwhile. I think a lot of times in these contexts, students just feel like, oh, I'm writing this, there's no point to it. But I think connecting them to this larger group of writers shows them the value of what they're doing. It also can, again, be more relevant in terms of like the topics that are being covered. That's where it's nice that we have students from a lot of different cultural backgrounds. So they can find, potentially topics that are more of relevance to their own lives. So yeah, that's a lot of it. So
tell us more about CRO then, the corpus and repository of writing. What we're discussing here. How what are the specifications, so to speak? How big is this corpus, and how long have you been developing it? Is this something that you're still kind of adding to with more students writing year on year? Tell us a bit more about when you're showing new students this corpus data, what are they actually kind of getting their hands on?
Yeah, so it's a corpus of first-year writing from 3 institutions currently. So University of Arizona, where I'm at, Northern Arizona, where I was, and Purdue University, where I was previously, to U of A. We actually also have a repository of teaching materials that go alongside the corpus, and some of them are actually directly linked to the corpus text, meaning that it's from the same instructor whose students have submitted to the corpus. So you can see a lot more of the context of what these assignments are. There are 32 assignment types in the corpus, so there's a lot of variation actually, which again, a lot of people kind of think of this context as, oh, we're just writing argumentative essays, but there's a lot more going on in it. So I like that part about it. And I actually kind of started this with Randy at NAU. We had a small corpus from the NAU writing program that we used for some research. But really it was when I went to Purdue and I had these amazing graduate students that really wanted to have some kind of database that could be shareable across the graduate student population and be able to be used by many researchers. And that's really the spirit of it, is being able to share this data with other researchers that are interested in this context. Currently, we have 18,000 texts, so over 18 million words are in the corpus. And it's definitely still growing. So I actually just this summer added another batch, and we're doing that pretty much every year. We're adding to the corpus. So it's also becomes a site for students to learn about corpus linguistics and corpus building. So I have a lab where I invite students to participate in the process of the corpus building. So it's also a learning site. And then finally, I just want to say about my amazing research team, which, this sort of started again at Purdue University with a colleague, Bradley Dilger, who's from rhetoric and composition, so not a corpus linguist at all. But we saw that we were kind of trying to do similar things in making these materials available to researchers. And so it's been a really generative research site to allow me to also learn about the field of rhetoric and composition a bit more and bring in some of the perspectives from their approach to my research and to the team as well.
So you're adding to it year on year, and it's growing. How do you? It's really interesting. How do you recruit, I suppose, participants? Is it a case where there's kind of an opt-in or an opt-out situation? As I imagine that for some students, the idea of somebody taking their essay, particularly if maybe they weren't very happy with it or they were disappointed with the grade they got, they might feel a little bit uncomfortable about that if they know that future students are going to be pouring through it and reading examples. So how, what's the kind of uptake? How popular is it? How easy is it, I suppose, to...
Yeah, so it's
to give you their data, right?
Yeah, it's really varied depending on the institution. So at NAU, we had actually the students had to submit a final portfolio as part of the class. And so there was, at the time that I was there and when we started collecting the corpus, an opt-in. So students would sign a consent, but it was kind of a blanket consent to use their papers for any research. So they would have the choice to do that. And then at Purdue, it was opt out. So that's why we have so much data from Purdue, is that we basically, and in both cases, all the cases, we're working closely with instructors as well. They're a huge part of the ability for us to gather the data. So at Purdue, it was mostly like if the instructor opted in, then we would have the data from their class, but we would follow up with the students, let them know this was happening with their texts, and give them the chance to opt out. At Arizona, we are going physically and, digitally into all of the classes. So we have to get assigned consent one way or another, online or in person, for each student. So that's a lot more labor intensive. But it's nice because I've been able to interact much more closely with the students who are contributing to the corpus. And interestingly, they don't seem too concerned about the quality of their own papers, but they actually sometimes want to have, some kind of ownership of that as well. So in recognition of that, because we de-identify all the papers, we remove the names, we assign numbers that are not related to any kind of student number, because we have a lot of metadata associated with the papers, including things like TOEFL scores, but also, language background, that kind of thing. So for students that kind of wanted that ownership, and to recognize that they're contributing to this project, we actually created a student essay contest. And so for students that participated in the corpus, we invited them to submit like their favorite paper. And then we had a little, adjudication amongst the team, and we awarded prizes, monetary, but also they were able to get published with their name and with their bio on our blog. So, we're trying to kind of balance out the need for this to be anonymous versus recognizing students writing in this way.
And so you've been working on this for a few years now and using it with each batch of first year students. I guess the obvious question is, what has been the reception? What sort of feedback or evidence of how useful it's been, have you received from the students who've been using the data?
Yeah, so we've been working on now a 4-year project, I guess, that's really looking at the impact of some of the materials that we've been able to develop from the corpus. And so that allows us to kind of see a little bit more firsthand the impact. We also have perception data from both the students and the instructors. And it was interesting. I think, when we started, we weren't sure what the students' reception would be. Would they think, oh, why are we looking at other students' papers? But actually, from the survey data that we've gotten, we've had, at least like 250 survey responses in terms of the effectiveness of this from the student perspective. And only one student out of all of those said, I don't think we should be using student data. So it's definitely very, very gratifying to kind of see what we thought, that students would really respond to this as these are peers and I'm learning from my peers. And they say things like, it's really helpful to see these assignments in context. And I also do work with another corpus that is not this high level, right? So you might think, oh, okay, this works for this high level student. But I also, the other corpus, cause that you mentioned at the beginning, it starts from like the 101 level for Portuguese and Russian. And those students too, they see the student text as very relevant to their lives. They call it real world language, which I think is really interesting because these are, again, student assignments from those classes, but they see it as relevant because they're talking about topics that are, coming up in their classes, but also related to their everyday lives. For the teachers, I think they also see what we've done with the materials is really try to align them with the course learning outcomes. And it helps that I'm very steeped in the first year writing. And then I have, for the other corpus, I have graduate students that are teaching those classes. So everybody's like really aware of what is important in these contexts. So we're able to create materials that really support the learning goals more broadly. And teachers are seeing that as well. And then with the research and being able to see sort of what are some of the developments, we've been able to see students developing skills, sort of developing genre conventions, like I was talking about earlier with the language that they're using, seeing if it's appropriate to the genre, and also thinking about the larger kind of discourse moves that they are able to see in the corpus and then apply to their own writing.
Oh, yes. So I wanted to pick up on that because it was really reassuring to hear that only one of the students, said that they weren't so happy or maybe didn't think it was such a good idea to look at students writing out of 250. That's not too bad, I don't think. But I guess this is, perhaps for academics at other universities who might be hearing this and going, oh, this sounds like a great idea. Maybe I could start to do something similar with my own students in my own context, or maybe otherwise, they already have experiences that are similar. Certainly in my case, I've had concerns in my teaching where students want to see previous examples of students' essays from the same module in previous years to get an example of what a successful response to the assignment looks like. Absolutely a reasonable thing to ask for. But then, of course, there's always a slight concern about plagiarism, right? I know it's an obvious question, but does that sort of concern kind of emerge? And is there a conversation to try to kind of mitigate against the risk of students inadvertently or otherwise using the Crow data kind of inappropriately or kind of relying on it too much in a way?
Yeah, this is a great question because this comes up a lot. So I work a lot with teachers, not only at my institution, but I've started doing what we call Crow Fellows, which is actually involving teachers from other institutions and using this data in their, so same context of this first year writing. And that's been really gratifying because we can see that actually what we're doing and what we have in the corpus is relevant for these other contexts and other institutions. But this is definitely a question that comes up a lot. And so that is part of the conversation that happens within that fellows space. So it's a group of teachers that are working, they're learning often about corpus linguistics for the first time. And so they also have these concerns because, like you said, many teachers use models in their classroom, but you want to make sure that, it's not just a matter of a student copying from that model. And I do think actually using a corpus is a way to get a little bit around this, because then you've got multiple models. And I think that's really the key with using models, is to have a variation so that students see that there's not just one way to do an assignment. If it becomes like, oh, everybody's doing it this way, then it becomes more formulaic. But if you can show them models where there are different pathways to achieving effective writing, then it actually enriches their idea of what effective writing is. And then they can also see, oh, I don't have to do it this one way. I think with the corpus examples too, sometimes, we do see a pattern, but then having conversations around, okay, so where would you use this pattern? Why would you use this pattern? What is the function of the language being used here? And then I love this example, so I'll share it again. I've shared it a lot of times, but we work with a literacy narrative as one of the assignments in this context. And so, of course, first person is what people usually use. But one of the students in the classes, saw that everybody was using first person. So they're like, oh, I'm going to try and use third person in my narrative and see how that works. Yeah, I know. So it's like, just because you see these patterns and people doing it a certain way doesn't mean that you have to make that choice. And that's where the instructor, of course, plays such a huge role in terms of making it a conversation with the students rather than the students just thinking, oh, everybody's doing it this way, so that's what I have to do.
That's reassuring to hear in a way, because I think, academic integrity is, a tale as old as time when it comes to higher education. But obviously these days with developments in generative AI, it's becoming even more of a kind of visible concern around the role of plagiarism and the use of others' data. I know we're going slightly off piste here, but I guess I wanted to ask you your thoughts on this. By kind of sort of pulling back the lid in a way and not just giving what you might traditionally do, as you said, just give one or two examples maybe of the models and sort of here's a couple of previous ones that got high grades and there you go. And then that kind of might restrict students. You're kind of opening up to lots and lots, as you said, I think 18,000 examples of previous submissions and previous essays. The rise of AI and the ways in which students are obviously, as everyone else is, kind of becoming more and more aware of how easy it is to access these tools. Do you think that this helps maybe to not necessarily put them off kind of using AI, but having this resource which is really specifically designed for them and contains only and exactly the sort of writing that they might want to take inspiration from? Do you think this is a valuable kind of alternative than if there's not really anything specifically for them, and students might feel tempted more to go off and use AI tools, which might help but might cause them problems depending on how they use it?
Yeah. So, my perspective as a writing teacher is, AI is a tool and students are going to use it. So, but they also need to learn how to use it well, right? And so I think that actually the corpus can help them, because one of my concerns is students not being aware of a genre or, particular type of discourse. And so they're not able to evaluate what AI is producing for them in really, critical, important ways. And so I'll mention this project because it was something that a member of our research team is, I think, currently working on. So her name is Wendy Gao. She's a researcher in China, and she teaches a class for students developing cover letters and resumes. And so what she's been doing is kind of showing students what the corpus, and she actually developed her own subset of Crow that's not available on the Crow website. But that she is kind of training them to kind of understand the genre conventions. And then when they go to the AI tool, they ask it to produce something, they can evaluate it so much better. And so I think that's one way in which we can see these kinds of tools working together, because we know that students are going to use them, and I don't feel like, an all-out ban makes any sense. But I think, developing that critical awareness, I think that's kind of where we're at least at this stage of our understanding of what students might be able to do with it. And so I think the corpus can actually help with that awareness.
I think you make a really good point in that, this is not something that you can ban away or expect people, students included, not to be using. But I suppose, that you've got a really compelling argument for is what one, not my perspective, but playing devil's advocate, somebody might ask, well, increasingly, what's the point in having these having corpora that we're building separately when it's all, some mythic idea that it's all just going to be in a large language model? And so, but I think you make a really strong case in favor of the value of having these dedicated repositories of, in this case, the essays that students can access, which is tailored to represent exactly the discourse community that you're kind of welcoming them to in a way. So I think that's certainly reassuring for me, and hopefully for other corpus builders too, that they're not out of a job yet. Not going to be replaced by the LLMs. I think I wanted to ask about, you mentioned Crow and the sort of public access to the text as well. So this is the entire corpus is available to public.
It is. So, but it's not completely public because you have to go through an application form, and this is where we have seen more and more people wanting to use it for AI. And so we are very clear about, and actually we need to be a little clearer. We've been working on kind of a statement about using it for AI, but we don't allow it to be just out on the web because, well, the first point is protecting these students' data, right? I mean, even though we do all the work to de-identify, we don't want it to just be out there for anybody to take for any purpose. I think, also writing instructors may not want it to be completely out there without their mediation, right? Because anytime we're having students have direct access to the corpus, the teacher is mediating that. And then with the emergence of AI, I mean, already before that, I didn't want somebody to just come and scrape the website, right? Like that was one reason why we don't have it just publicly available completely. And so that's become even more of a concern with these new developments. And so we have actually denied access to folks that are wanting to use it for those purposes.
Wow, it's a new world living in, really, in a way, isn't it? But I think that absolutely makes sense, particularly the ethical aspects as well. I think I'm certainly seeing it at my own institution. Ethical regulations are tightening up, particularly when it comes, slightly different context, but the broad idea is the same when it comes to gathering texts that are in the public domain online. For a long time, the kind of de facto approach in applied linguistics and corpus linguistics seems to be, well, if you can access it without needing an account, or if it's just anybody could Google it, then you can just take it and you don't even have to ask. That seems to, at least informally, kind of been just the general rule of thumb. But now that seems to be changing, and I think there's more responsibility being taken, and maybe partly this is in response to what we're seeing now with kind of the logical endpoint of that approach. I mean, most corpus researchers are never, or very rarely going to be building data sets anywhere near that size. It's much more of a small scale kind of local thing they're doing with text. But if you take that to the opposite extreme, then you can see maybe that approach isn't actually ethically appropriate, especially when actually they're going beyond that and they're taking stuff that they absolutely shouldn't anyway, and just, seeing if anybody's going to stop them. Bit of a rant on that stuff, but I think that's...
Yeah, and I think it's something to be thinking about, because we all want, I mean, I definitely want to contribute to open data science, right? Like that's part of the project's goal, is to be able to share this data with people that want to use it. But I think with that becomes a responsibility to treat the data ethically, right? And so that's where I'm so glad that, when we started this project, we basically decided, yes, it's going to be free, but there are certain restraints on it. And so even like the public site, we really wanted to set that up also for teachers primarily. So if researchers want to use the data, then we have actually a smaller sample that we provide as an offline corpus. And so even that we've kind of curated both, I mean, I'd say like a big part of that is thinking about like what would be a good data set for research versus what is a good data set for teaching. And so the entire corpus makes sense for teaching because you can find, maybe you only find a few examples of a particular assignment type. And that's fine for teaching, right? But for research, we want to make sure that we have enough of a particular domain in order to be able to say something about it. And so that's where we've kind of curated to a portion of the corpus for researchers. And then we make that available offline. They have to go through actually an additional training to get the offline corpus. They definitely have to say they're not going to use it for commercial purposes. And even for like teaching materials, it's fine if you want to do that within your own class and course management system, but we don't want people publishing teaching materials from it, partly because we're working on that and probably going to do it, but also just kind of to have a little bit more control over the data. So there are things like that where we've really had to think about, okay, yes, we want this to be open, but we also feel that constraints are useful.
I think, as we discussed earlier, this is a learning corpus that is not necessarily typical of what learner corpora usually might be or what they're thought of. And in several ways, I think. And maybe one of them, in addition to I think you've called it the asset-oriented approach we were discussing earlier, and not sort of looking at it from a deficit perspective, so much as embracing and describing what is there and how the writing functions. But as you presumably you're going to carry on adding to this corpus in years to come, and from a research perspective, if it is the case, as you said, that students are, whether we tell them they should or shouldn't, they're going to be using generative AI tools, a bit of a chicken and the egg kind of situation, but maybe that might become a data source where you may actually see the effect that AI is having on their writing.
Yeah.
Some of the questions that are floating around at the moment around, can a human really tell? I think I'm quite good, but I know that can't be true because the research that's out there so far is that humans are not very good at detecting AI writing. So I definitely have some kind of biases. I think I'm quite good at it because I know that can't be right. But maybe, I don't know, I know it sort of takes you even further away from kind of the main purpose of it, but I wonder what your thoughts are on whether it might be a place where you might see that if it is the case that students are using such tools.
Yeah, potentially. I think that's where it's helpful that we have a little bit more of the contextual information, because I think for some of the classrooms, they may be very restrictive on the use of AI. And not to say that a student couldn't, like it couldn't get through, but they're that's the other thing with plagiarism more broadly. Like there are teachers in a smallish classroom that are looking at these texts. And so people ask about, before AI, people were asked about like how much of this is plagiarized. I mean, we don't know, right? We haven't run it through a plagiarism detector, but we trust our teachers, right? And we know that teachers are aware of plagiarism, AI use, all of those things. And so they're the ones that are looking at these texts, and they're going to be mediating with the student, the final product that they're producing. Now, we do have drafts, so that might be something that we could even see potentially in some of the earlier drafting versus later drafting, which would be interesting to see. But then also kind of seeing what the policy is of the instructor whose students are submitting their papers, because I think that's a huge contextual factor, of course, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really fascinating example of what a learner corpus outside of the kind of mainstream context. We see learner corpus obviously in the ELT kind of mainstream ELT context, and it's a really cool example of viewing it a little bit differently, I think, and it's really great to hear about this from you. We will start to wrap up now. I'm keeping one eye on the clock, but zooming out of the specific context that we've been discussing, it's sort of piggybacking off what we were just talking about in a way. What do you think learner corpora in the future, what sort of contribution do you think that they will continue to be able to make, or do you see any new emerging opportunities for the sort of data that you work with? We've talked a lot about Crow, but more broadly as well in your research.
Yeah, maybe I'll just talk a little bit more about this asset-oriented approach, because I think it is something that I'm really interested in, and I hope that people can think about with learner data more generally. So this is a term that's, I think, used a little bit more in the US. Actually, TESOL, the organization, just came out with a statement about asset-oriented approaches towards language learning. And as you said, in the very simplistic terms, it's kind of like shifting from deficit to really looking at what students are bringing into the classroom, working with, the resources that they're bringing in, rather than always focusing on what they don't have. Of course, students wouldn't be in our classes if they didn't need some instruction. So it's not saying we don't instruct them, but, it's kind of starting from where they are and working to with those strengths that they're bringing in and building off of that. So I'm hoping that we can see a little bit more of that going on. In addition, I'm not saying we shouldn't look at errors, because, students need negative evidence too, but I think there's a lot more that we can do with these data sets. Of course, there's a lot more that can be done looking at development, and especially longitudinal. We've been talking about this for a long time, but working more towards longitudinal data sets. And that's one of the things that has emerged from this corpus, and actually Macaw's as well, is that we have a certain subset of students that have actually submitted for multiple semesters. And so we're able to look a bit longitudinally at that individual development, which I think is really exciting. And then also to kind of, especially with, other languages than English, kind of seeing, what we can expect from students at different course levels. Of course, there's going to be a lot of variation, because course level is not necessarily proficiency level, but kind of seeing how students progress through a sequence of courses, I think is really valuable, especially for, teachers and administrators to understand what's going on in their classes. So that's, a little bit different than just thinking of these as markers of proficiency level as well. And then I'm also excited about some of the new data collection that's happening outside of, the US, where I am, and the UK. And as you mentioned, so many of the learner corpora are in the EFL setting, but they are a little bit constrained, right? So the new corpus that's being built by the Lancaster Group in English as a medium of instruction context. I've also been working with a scholar in Ghana on first-year writing, basically, and in his context. So kind of getting out of our very heavily research focused universities. I've also been working, as I said, with teachers outside of those contexts, specifically in the US, community college instructors. And so I hope eventually we can collect data from those sites as well. And there's interest on the part of teachers, but of course you have to kind of balance out the research goals and the teaching goals. So I think there's a lot of opportunities still for corpus development, but then also using these corpora in different ways.
Well, the future sounds bright and busy as well, by the sounds. Yes. Plenty to do, which is always great to hear. Shelley, thank you so much. We're going to bring things to a close with just one more quick question, which I like to ask at the end. I used to ask three, but I realized it was maybe a little bit unduly, felt like maybe a bit of an interrogation. So I've taken to reducing it just to one. And for you, I'd like to ask, in general, not necessarily specifically to your own research context, but in general, for students embarking on corpus research for the first time or studying corpus linguistics for the first time, what's your number one piece of advice for students who are completely new to this and studying it for the first time?
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of going to the end of the process and thinking about the contribution and what they want to make, and also maybe how they see people using the research. Because I think sometimes, it happens in any field, but I think with corpus linguistics, we have some available corpora. And so I think people sometimes get constrained by that. We also have some available tools that people are constrained by. And so not letting that dictate so much what you're doing, but really thinking long and hard about the contributions you want to make. I think the other thing that I would say, maybe a little bit more specific to learner corpora, but I think in general, just thinking about the comparisons that you're making, because, so much of what I do and many people do is comparing across corpora. And what I've found is that, if you get closer and closer to a real comparison, actually, like at this level with the Crow corpus, there's very little difference between the L1 and the L2 writers, because we do have L1 writers in this corpus too. And so just thinking about what you're comparing and why you're comparing and what you want to get out of that. So that's kind of two things. But
Thank you. 2 for 1. I really appreciate it. Well, thanks again, Shelley, for joining us today. It's been a really interesting conversation, and really appreciate hearing more about your research and the really great perspectives that you have on how learner corpus research may be shifting a little bit into maybe a bit more of a new direction. So that's it for this week's episode of CorpusCast. In fact, this month's episode of CorpusCast. Here's me thinking I'm suddenly launching weekly episodes. That's not happening, I assure you. But thank you for joining us, our viewers and listeners, on your platform of choice, be that YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. As always, do let us know your thoughts using the hashtag CorpusCast, and make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on X at Aston Corpus. And you can follow me at Lovermob. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by my wonderful colleague, Sam Cook, who always brings me joy and never anything else. Bit of an in-joke there for you. We've had some fun today behind the scenes. So thanks again to you, our listeners, and thanks most of all, of course, to Professor Shelley Staples for joining us today for this episode of CorpusCast. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.